Welcome to AkronHipHop.com, where we paint positive images of our people every day. My name is Debra Calhoun. I teach at Kent State University in the Department of Pan-African Studies. And we're going to, through these works, understand the Black experience. Hey, Hiram, how are you today?
Hey, man, I am okay. I'm excited. But first off, let me tell you what I'm excited about. I'm excited that I get to be in your class and just ask any damn question I want to ask.
Any question you got, I think I'm ready for it.
What are we talking about today?
Today we're going to talk about foundational pieces of legislation, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendment.
Okay, let's go with it. Let's go with the first one.
Yes, the 13th Amendment. I will say, first of all, remember we had this thing called the Civil War in this country. And this was a way to address the economic, legal, and political status of at least 4 million former slaves in the United States that were actively functioning and operating.
So you tell me after slavery, it was 4 million of us hanging out in America?
Yes, 4 million.
That's a lot.
It is.
Who's going to build it?
We built this country economically.
Well, okay, let's go with it. I'm just excited. I get to talk. I get to raise my hand and call it on.
Great.
Let's go.
Yes, the 13th Amendment, passed in 1865, ends the system of slavery. Slavery is now the bad word. The system that we know of, plantation, terror, whipping, cotton, work, sun up to sundown, is over. Done and done with. So it ends the system of slavery. The 14th Amendment, passed in 1868, grants citizenship to those of former slave status. I will say, just as a side note, at least anywhere from 10 to 12% of that 4 million African Americans in this country had free status. They were never slaves. So that collectively gave them the status of citizens. So we hear and read where the Constitution and the Bill of Rights talk about citizenry and citizens, that now was to include that 4 million former slaves. The 15th Amendment, passed in 1870, grants men the right to vote. We know that women would not get the right to vote until the 20th Amendment, passed in 1919. And the reason why these amendments are so important, it helps you, as we see the way that the South, salty over losing the Civil War, was able to not live and implement the spirit of these 3 amendments. Now, how did the South do this? I think we can look at these things either from an economic perspective, a political perspective, and a social perspective. First, economically. As I mentioned, slavery is now the bad word. Slaves are now free, able to go where they could. Many went to try to find and connect with their families, because we know that the slave system separated families and did not recognize husbands with wives, did not recognize family with mothers and fathers. Families were split and torn asunder. So many went to try to seek out those individuals. And if you look at any of the newspapers in this country, 1870 or so, you see ads in the paper asking for, looking for, seeking for. Have you seen my wife? Her name was Bessie. She looks like this. I'm in need of her. My name is John. Please have her get in touch with me. I'm at XYZ address. And in these kind of ways, folks tried to seek out and identify family. But the South, again, was still salty over losing the Civil War. So they economically were broken. We can imagine, if you could, think 4 million Black folks working for free for over 200 years, how much wealth that amasses. We know that many slave owners or slave holders or people that held stock in companies got rich off the slave system. The man who created or wrote the song Amazing Grace had a net worth in the 18th century of $60 million. And this is 1800 money. So he was quite wealthy as he sees the light and writes Amazing Grace as a way to absolve his conscience of his role in slavery. So economically, we find that the South do 3 particular strategies or tactics, if you will, to keep Black folks chained to the plantation, if you will. Sharecropping, tenant farming, debt peonage, and convict lease. Each of these 3 or 4 labor systems were ways with which African Americans, former slaves, were still tied to the land, though in theory they were supposed to be free agents and working at will. Now we know how the system of sharecropping worked. You had to get land, you had to get access to tools, machinery, starter seed. You had to feed your family while the first crop was growing up. So basically you had to share the crop with the owner of the land. Now the owners of these lands basically were the same plantation owners that owned the plantations. They just divided the land into smaller plots, and the Calhoun clan would have one piece, the Joneses would have another one, the Smiths would have another plot of land. But the problem is when you understand that African Americans were not literate because it was illegal to teach slaves to read and write, how do you know when you caught up? You're just going by the word of one person that says, oh, well, Sir Calhoun, you're not caught up. You got to work another season to pay me off. So in these kind of ways, collectively, the black community was still held captive to land that they formerly were working as slaves on. Debt peonage. When there are debts to be paid, it was against the law for a man or woman to leave the jurisdiction where the debt was made. But again, how do you know the debt is paid? How do you know you've worked long enough? It's slavery with another name, in essence, all of these forms of labor systems. Convict lease, one of my favorite forms and strategies of what the Southerners used. They would have convicts work for free on public work projects. Convicts would work growing agricultural produce. They worked in railroads. They worked digging rocks, taking big rocks, making them smaller rocks. The whole point is that they had to pay off their fines garnered for petty crimes with their labor. And again, how do you know when you paid the bill? You're stuck in a situation because it was against the law to leave. Anytime you left a situation owing someone money, that was grounds to be either whipped and or put back in jail for a longer period of time. So we have those ways economically that they're positioned and kept impoverished. Now, I mentioned that the 15th Amendment granted men the right to vote, and that would include black men. And the outcome and the success of that is that during the period of Reconstruction, we had 21 black men in the House of Representatives. So we understood the power of the vote. We understood that if you put folks in power, in office, to create legislation that was impactful to the African community, that was a plus and a win-win. So how does the South put obstacles in that path? They do it by several types of ways. They did poll taxes, where one had to show a tax being paid for the right to vote. Now, if you're a transient community and you're not cognizant of the idea of the need to keep pen and paper and receipts, because you had to show proof of having paid the tax. Remember, the African community was migratory after the Civil War. They weren't allowed to read and write. So who's going to keep paper? No one. So again, if you can't prove that you have paid the tax previously, you were not allowed to vote. Secondly, they use a form or a strategy called the literacy test. And that was done at the point of registering to vote, where the magistrate of hearing the case of someone who's coming to register would pull a passage out of the Constitution and ask them to interpret it. Kind of hard to do. Again, a literacy test totally against the law, totally against the spirit of the 15th Amendment, but used as an impediment. The third way was with the grandfather clause. And the grandfather clause stated that if your grandfather voted in the election of 1868, you could vote. Now, here's the kicker with that. The 15th Amendment is not passed until 1870. So it's a bust right there. You're not able to vote because nobody's black grandfather voted in the election of 1868. So again, these are just impediments put in the way of keeping an electorate from accessing their power. And the reason why this was so important, the Southerners clearly understood with 21 men in the House of Representatives, these folks know enough to know to vote. And we need to break any semblance of growing black power politically on the part of growing and newly emergent, cognizant, aware African-American people. The other way legally where these things are kind of boxed in and serves to be impediments to the African community is Plessy versus Ferguson. Supreme Court case 1896 passes and has the understanding that separate is equal. And what this means is that it legalizes segregation at the state and at the local level because it's a Supreme Court decision that affects all the states. And what this does is that creates this secondary system of operation throughout the South. Separate bathrooms, separate water fountains, separate school systems, separate cemeteries, separate theaters, separate entrances. And again, the idea is separate but equal. And it would not be broken, Plessy would not be done away with until the Brown v. Board of Education decision in 1954, which did away with separate is equal because the problem is separate is never equal. And what the Supreme Court was able to do later, some 60 or 50 some years after, they were able to prove that the expenditures for education was not equal to that of white education. So these three pieces of legislation are called companion legislation, civil rights legislation, but it would open the door to later advocacy and pushing forward and creating a truly United States, which took a long time to do. This is AkronHipHop.com. Thank you for watching. If you're watching on YouTube, remember to like, share, and subscribe. Hit the notification bell. If you are watching on YouTube, or Facebook, remember to share, and share again. And again, from myself and Brother Hiram, I thank you and good day.